Hi, my name is Mandy Nevius, and I'm a member of Tulsa Chorale. Thank you for joining me today for the first episode of our series, Beethoven and the Beatles, Celebrating the Revolutionaries. Today I'll walk you through Beethoven's life, and then I'll launch right into how the Beatles got their start. There's a lot of information in this episode, so hold on tight. We'll begin with Beethoven. Ludwig von Beethoven was born in December 1770 in Bonn, Germany. Interestingly, however, Beethoven believed he was born in 1772 until he was 40 years old. The reason for this was that his father wanted to exploit Beethoven's musical talent by having him pass as an infant prodigy, and so advertised that Beethoven was born 2 years later than he was. Because Beethoven was small for his age, his father got away with the lie. Beethoven's first known public performance was on March 26, 1778. He played concertos and trios on the clavier. Beethoven's hot-tempered, abusive father insisted that he practice every chance he got, and as a result, Beethoven was not encouraged in his education outside of music, and he began a habit of keeping to himself rather than engaging in any kind of social life. Beethoven began lessons with Christian Gottlob Neef, who was the court organist. Neef taught Beethoven thorough bass and composition. He also predicted that Beethoven would be as great as Mozart. Beethoven's first printed composition was written in 1783 when he was 12 years old. That same year, Neef named Beethoven the assistant court organist, who filled in for Neef when he was away. This gave Beethoven valuable experience with reading full scores at sight. In 1787, Beethoven had the opportunity to travel to Vienna and meet Mozart, but within 2 weeks of arriving in Vienna, Beethoven had to return to Bonn to be with his dying mother, who passed away a few weeks later at the age of 40. Beethoven became the head of the household over his reckless father and his younger siblings. The following year in Bonn, Beethoven joined a group of young virtuosos organized by Count Waldstein, who took Beethoven under his wing and assisted him with financial gifts that Waldstein claimed came from the Elector. Beethoven played viola with this orchestra for 4 years until the French Revolution led to its dissolution in 1792. Another key supporter in young Beethoven's life was Helena von Breuning. As a kind of substitute mother, Helena attempted to assuage Beethoven's obstinance and temper, as well as help sophisticate and socialize him. In November 1792, Beethoven arrived in Vienna to study under Haydn. Though he would later declare that he had learned nothing from Haydn, Beethoven was clearly influenced by Haydn's teaching, as he emerged a few months later a far more refined composer. In May 1793, Haydn took Beethoven with him to the Esterhazy Palace in Eisenstadt to introduce Beethoven to Prince Nicholas, who would commission Beethoven's Mass in C 14 years later. Beethoven's lessons with Haydn never resumed after this trip, but the two would remain in contact. Upon returning to Vienna, Beethoven competed in improvisation contests against some of the finest pianists in the city. His victories won him fame. Meanwhile, he composed his piano trios, piano sonatas, cello sonatas, string trios, violin sonatas, and string quartets. But Beethoven's seemingly bright future would be threatened by an unpredictable hurdle: deafness. Following a serious illness, likely typhus, his hearing began deteriorating around 1796 or 97. He would be 60% deaf by 1801 and completely deaf by 1816 at the age of 46. Nevertheless, Beethoven relentlessly pursued music. The year 1800 marks the turning point in Beethoven's career. On April 2nd, at Vienna's Burgtheater, Beethoven staged his first benefit concert. The concert included 7 numbers, including Beethoven, along with the orchestra, performing one of his piano concertos, the public premiere of his septet for winds and strings, a piano improvisation played by Beethoven, and the premiere of his first symphony. He also gained more financial backing that year from Prince Lichnowsky, which gave him the freedom to compose whatever he desired. Though his music was gaining acclaim, he suffered from depression for 2 years because of the decline of his hearing. But bringing him out of this sad time was Countess Juliette Guicciardi. There was no chance of marriage, for she was nobility and he was a commoner, but he loved her all the same, and he dedicated his Moonlight Sonata to her, his most intimate, creative, and varied work at the time. In 1802, Beethoven moved north of Vienna to Heiligenstadt, where he made progress on the Eroica Symphony, wrote 3 piano sonatas, and completed his Second Symphony. He also wrote his last will and testament, known as Heiligenstadt Testament, which was addressed to his brothers and acknowledged his deafness. It was never sent, and it was discovered only after his death. In 1805, Beethoven's first and only opera, Leonora, later known as Fidelio, premiered, and it was not a success at the time. Despite this disappointment, Beethoven had an extremely productive period between 1804 and 1808, when he produced his 4th, 5th, and 6th symphonies, along with over a dozen other masterpieces. Still, Beethoven struggled to secure a steady income due to the Napoleonic Wars, which fluctuated currencies and affected the fortunes of Beethoven's patrons. But when Beethoven was offered the position of Kapellmeister to Napoleon's brother in Kassel, Archduke Rudolf, Prince Lobkowitz, and Prince Kinsky wrote a contract in 1809 stating that they would pay Beethoven an annuity for life, but only if he remains in Vienna. Beethoven accepted the offer. While working on his own music, Beethoven gave lessons in both piano and composition, though his irritability made it difficult for Beethoven to retain many of his students. The pupils that spoke about his teaching stated that, for Beethoven, observing marks of expression was tantamount to incorrect notes. His most loyal student was the Archduke Rudolf, who studied with Beethoven from around 1803 to 1820. Because of Beethoven's increased deafness, he eventually stopped playing the piano publicly. But as he withdrew from performing, Beethoven reached the height of his career. He worked closely with Johann Nepomuk Maelzel to write Wellington's Victory, or the Battle Symphony. It premiered at a charity concert which raised money for wounded veterans on December 8, 1813, along with Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. The audience demanded an encore for the slow movement of the Seventh, and the Battle Symphony was received with such gusto, perhaps more than any symphonic premiere in Beethoven's life. So triumphant was the premiere that the concert was repeated 4 days later. In July the following year, Beethoven's opera, now revived and called Fidelio, was a smashing success and garnered the attention of kings and emperors. But shortly following these accomplishments, Beethoven's music fell out of popularity, many thinking his best years were behind him. Beethoven's personal life became much more complicated on November 15, 1815, when his brother Karl died, appointing his wife and Beethoven as co-guardians of his son Karl. Beethoven spent several years in court battling for sole guardianship. This was eventually granted, though Karl never lost touch with his mother. These legal problems, combined with his declining health, slowed his creativity. But between 1817 and 1823, Beethoven would have one last productive period in which he composed 4 piano sonatas, the Missa Solemnis, the Diabelli Variations, and one of the most famous works in classical music, his Ninth Symphony. In 1826, Beethoven would write his last completed work, the String Quartet in F major. He would write this after a tumultuous period with his nephew Karl, who had just attempted suicide. This was also written as Beethoven's own body was failing. Beethoven died on March 26, 1827. As many as 20,000 people crowded the streets of Vienna for the funeral. In the history of Western music, Beethoven remains one of the most widely known and influential composers. Thank you for listening to this section of our video discussing Beethoven's life. Before we continue to talk about the Beatles' early years, I wanted to quickly remind you of Tulsa Chorale's upcoming concert celebrating Beethoven's 250th birthday and the Beatles' 60th birthday. Our concert will take place on October 13th at the Admiral Twin Drive-In and will include a showing of Tulsa Chorale's virtual performance of the Kyrie and Gloria from Beethoven's Mass in C, a screening of the film Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and a live performance of Beatles songs by Tulsa's own Retro Rockets. Tickets will be $20 per car and will be available at the gate or in advance online. The gate will open at 6:45 and the concert will begin at 7:30. It's going to be a fantastic evening celebrating these revolutionaries. You won't want to miss it. Now for the Beatles. As you likely already know, the Beatles were made up of four Liverpool lads: John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. All four Beatles were born during World War II. During this time, their hometown, which was once a seaport teeming with opportunity, was repeatedly attacked with German bombs. The world into which they were born was crumbling. Though Liverpool would never fully recover, it did welcome sailors to its ports again, and in the 50s and 60s, these sailors would travel back from the United States with records of American hits, first country western, then rock and roll and blues. It was also in the 50s that Liverpool teenagers would press their ears against their radios to listen to rock and roll, which was barely audible through the crackling sounds of static, since it was broadcasted from a faraway radio station in Luxembourg. Popular music from the generation before did not resonate with teenagers who craved music that they could relate to, that spoke to their feelings of angst, impatience, love, sexuality, insecurity, rebellion, and fantasy. Rock and roll filled that void for young people. It gave them an avenue to express themselves. It was raw, loud, disobedient, and thrilling. As rock and roll grew in popularity, two admirers of the genre happened to meet, an event that would change the world. It was July 6, 1957. With his band called the Quarrymen, 16-year-old John Lennon played for a large crowd of friends and family at a garden festival in front of St. Peter's Church in Woolton. They played a blend of rock and roll and skiffle, which is a kind of unrefined music that had less to do with skill and more to do with spirit. This style of music suited John well, as he was not a skilled musician yet. After the show, a friend of his introduced him to 15-year-old Paul McCartney, who boldly picked up his guitar and performed a complicated song that the Quarrymen were unable to learn on their own. John was immediately taken aback by Paul's talent. He knew he wanted Paul in the band, but he was afraid of losing his position as band leader. In the end, John sensed that it was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. 3 months later, on October 18th, Paul made his debut appearance with the Quarrymen. But due to extreme nervousness, he mangled one of his solos, and the entire song came crashing down. Instead of berating him, John pushed through this startling moment by laughing, and then they carried on with the rest of the set. Both boys had limited knowledge about chord structure and technique, but that didn't stop them from finding a way to reproduce the sounds they heard on rock and roll records. They practiced together as often as they could. It was at one of their practices that Paul mentioned to John that he had written a few of his own songs, one in particular called I Lost My Little Girl. When John heard the song, he was stunned by this epiphany. They spent the spring of 1958 writing songs together, including Love Me Do, I Call Your Name, and One After 909, all of which would eventually appear on Beatles albums. Also that spring, Paul knew a boy at his school who could play guitar better than anyone he knew, and considered his own talent could be an asset to the Quarrymen. On March 12, 1958, he invited 15-year-old George Harrison to one of the Quarrymen's gigs at a skiffle club called the Morgue. Paul introduced George to John, and George played his guitar for the band. He was brilliant, but John could not get over how young George was. Paul engineered another meeting, this time on the upper deck of a city bus. After hearing George play again, John relented and invited George to join the band. With George's talent, the other Quarrymen members faded away from the band until there was only John, Paul, George, and a drummer named Colin Hanton. After some time had passed, John and Paul had been improving their guitar skills from playing with George, but they noticed Colin was pulling them down. When they expressed their frustration with Colin, an argument erupted and he was out of the band. They aimlessly felt their way through the rest of 1958 and 1959 without a drummer. However, the following year showed promise. The band spent time rehearsing at the apartment of Stuart Sutcliffe, one of John's friends from college. Despite not knowing how to play the bass guitar or sing, John invited Stuart to join the band. It was when he was hanging out with Stuart one day that John was inspired to rename the band to The Beatles, Beatals, though it would be another few months before the spelling was officially changed to what it is today. A popular singer that performed at a local coffee house found them a drummer by the name of Tommy Moore, and by the summer of 1960, they were on their first tour in Scotland, backing a rising star named Johnny Gentle. While Johnny was good, They were the ones who drew in the crowds. Their future seemed bright. But then when they returned to Liverpool, Tommy left the band, once again leaving the group without a drummer. Desperate for an open gig in Hamburg, the band needed to find a drummer, and fast. They spent a lot of time hanging out in coffee shops and dance clubs. It was at one of their stops that they found a promising drummer for their band. The Casbah was a private coffee club in the basement of a sizable home owned by John and Mona Best. Their son, Pete Best, who played drums for the Blackjacks, owned his own drum set, seemed to play pretty good, and girls found him very attractive. They offered Pete £15 a week to leave the Blackjacks and play with them. Pete, who was a fan of the Beatles, didn't hesitate. So with that, they were given the gig in Hamburg and left on August 16, 1960. In Hamburg, the Beatles were expected to play 4.5 hours during weeknights and 6 hours on weekend nights. They were disappointed with the dismal club, and the customers weren't particularly interested in their stiff performances. When the club owner complained, they began clowning around in what they thought was ridiculous behavior for a rock and roll band. But the club owner loved their mock performance. Now they not only played well, but they generated excitement too. Soon people flocked to the club to watch them perform. They were so good that the club owner moved them across the street to perform at his showplace, the Kaiserkeller. They shared a bill with another Liverpool band called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, whose drummer was Ringo Starr. Every evening was a massive jam session with a bit of friendly competition between the two bands. The Beatles would play 56 nights at the Kaiserkeller. It all ended when 3 of the 5 band members were deported. The Beatles occasionally performed at the Top 10, a more popular club around the corner. The jealous Kaiserkeller owner wanted the Beatles to play only at his club. He fabricated a story about the band attempting to set his club on fire. Paul and Pete were arrested and then deported. A few days before this, George, who was only 17 and therefore underage, was deported. By December, they were able to pick up a few gigs in Liverpool. It was apparent that they weren't the same band that left for Hamburg a few months before, and they quickly became the city's must-see band. They were in great demand, sometimes securing multiple shows in one day. Some fans were so devoted that they would follow the bands from club to club. Soon they were back in Hamburg playing at the Top 10, and it wasn't long before lines of people waiting to see the Beatles perform flowed out of the club. But it was obvious, especially to Paul, that Stewart was holding the band back with his amateur bass playing. He was also jealous of the attention Stewart received for his fashion. He was, in fact, the first one of the Beatles to sport the mop top. And Paul was resentful for Stewart's close relationship with John. A few days after a fight between Paul and Stewart broke out on stage, Stewart left the band, handing his bass guitar over to Paul. Back in Liverpool in 1961, Brian Epstein, the manager of the most popular record shop in Liverpool, had heard a lot of buzz about the Beatles and decided to go with a colleague to hear them play at a nearby club known as the Cavern, despite his aversion to rock and roll. To his own surprise, Brian thought they were phenomenal. He finally offered to manage their band, and the Beatles eagerly accepted. They hoped a record deal was right around the corner, but they suffered disappointment after disappointment. Every major record label in London did not find them special. This was especially aggravating to the Beatles because they felt that they had sacrificed so much by playing by Brian's new rules. No eating on stage, no smoking, no punching each other, no flirting with girls, no taking song requests, bowing all together after every song, and wearing suits during performances. It was also during this time of rejection that the end of Pete's time in the Beatles began. On February 5th, 1962, Pete called in sick for a gig that night that none of the other Beatles wanted to give up. After a few phone calls, they secured Ringo Starr from the Hurricanes to play for them. Ringo would have officially replaced Pete 6 months later. But before that, John, Paul, George, and Pete traveled to Hamburg one last time. They were excited to return, especially so they could see their former bandmate Stewart, who was engaged to a German girl. But they were shocked to find out that Stewart had died a few days before they arrived from a brain aneurysm. Meanwhile, Brian acquired a recording session for the Beatles with Parlophone. Upon returning to Liverpool, John couldn't wait to tell his girlfriend Cynthia about the news, but she had news for him. She was pregnant. John was concerned about how this would affect his career, but he would marry her by the end of the summer, and Julian Lennon was born the following April. The Beatles' appointment at Parlophone with director George Martin took place only 4 days after they returned from Hamburg. In the north of London at Abbey Road Studio, the recording session included a quick run-through of 32 songs, including 2 originals titled Please Please Me and Love Me Do. Martin was not impressed by their material, their songwriting, nor their sound, but what won Martin over was their wit. He knew they were special, and promised them a proper recording session in the future. But before this, the Beatles needed to make some changes, most notably letting go of Pete, who was only an adequate drummer, not fit for a professional band. So on August 16, 1962, Brian fired him. 3 days later, Ringo made his debut with the Beatles. From then on, the Beatles would always be John, Paul, George, and Ringo. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Next time, we'll dig into the recording of the Beatles' first 2 albums. We'll also discuss the history behind Beethoven's Mass in C. I hope you'll join me. Bye for now.